to sit here, Dr. Langton. That.
Call me John, will you, Brian?
We'll do John. All right. All right, so when did you start at Westminster?
I started at Westminster in 1981. I had received my PhD from Georgetown in 1980, and I looked around for jobs in DC, and they were hard to come by, but I always wanted to teach at a small liberal arts college, but jobs at small liberal arts colleges were even harder to come by. And I was concerned. I was concerned that I might never be a professor as I hoped I would be. But finally, I applied for a number of jobs, and I was invited to come out to Westminster and interview for a job. My wife was then pregnant with our first daughter, and I came out, and I had always thought that I was going to teach at a small liberal arts college on the East Coast, because before I came here, I had never been any further west than Pittsburgh. So the Midwest was not really on my oscilloscope, as it were, but nevertheless I came out, and I was picked up by a couple of Westminster political science majors, senior political science majors. And the first night after I arrived in the afternoon, they took me down to a drinking establishment called Winston's, which was across from the post office, which was then operating. And we went down at about 8 o'clock at night, and the place was rocking and rolling. And I thought, wow, this is something. At any rate, they said, this is a great place to go to school. You can get a great education, and there's some social life as well. So I thought, okay, I know all about that. At any rate, the next day, I met Peter Kim, who was then the chair of the political science department here. And fairly early on, the conversation turned to how much we both loved to play tennis. And I knew then that Westminster was the place for me, and that I was going to be hired here. And I say that only half facetiously. I went back and told my wife I had this job, and we came out here from DC in a U-Haul trailer with our then 3-month-old daughter on her carriage bed between us. And I've been here ever since, and I've loved it. And I guess in retrospect, Westminster has been everything that I hoped I would find at a small liberal arts college. That I would be able to interact with my students, that I would get to know my students, that I would come to know and become friends with my colleagues, that I was primarily interested in being a teacher, and that Westminster puts a premium on being a teacher, and that I could also do some research and have some opportunities to grow intellectually. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that Westminster was the place for me, and that I was actually meant to be a professor at a small liberal arts college. Well, in those early years, among the fond memories was playing tennis against Peter Kim, who turned out to be a very crafty opponent. We had some Herculean battles. There were a lot of, but on the other hand, in the early years, there were a lot of demonstrations at Westminster. A lot of speakers were brought in who the faculty, mostly being liberal Democrats, did not fully appreciate, like Bill Casey. And my colleagues, early on, Bill Casey, the former CIA director, was invited to speak on campus. And my, my colleagues in my first year convinced me it would be a good idea if I organized a demonstration against him. And I thought, well, I'm used to participating in demonstrations, because when I was going to Georgetown, there were demonstrations in the 70s all the time. So oh sure, I'll organize that demonstration against Bill Casey. And I was then told subsequently that the president of the college at that time said to Pat Kirby, fire him. And, or actually didn't say it to Pat Kirby, but said it to former Dean Mattingly, fire him. and Dean Mattingly said, we can't do that. We can't do that. But that was a fond memory. I also, well, anyway, I remember a lot of demonstrations. I remember a lot of demonstrations, political demonstrations. I remember growing close to a lot of faculty members who have now unfortunately retired. But always, always it was the students and making contact with some students and finding students that I could relate to and who could relate to me. And I would say that recently a number of my students raised more than $1.2 million to endow a professorship in my name. And in organizing that project, two of the students who organized it, the main organizers were Jim Bennett and Phil Beckman. And then Elizabeth Cole also stepped in. Elizabeth Brown she was at the time. But in organizing that project, I sat down and I thought, let me look over my old roll books and see how many students I had some kind of a relationship which I would describe as a mentoring relationship outside of the classroom, where we didn't just interact in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, we talked about politics, we talked about culture, we talked about their career ambitions, and I wrote down 750 names. I wrote down 750 names of students with whom I had, and of those 750 names, I usually also said, did they have more than one class with me? And some of those students had 3, 4, 5 classes with me. And I don't think in another school I could have had situations where I would have a student in 3 classes or 4 classes. One of my students actually took 7 classes with me. Took basically every class I taught. And so I thought, wow, that's really special. And I could think about those students. And then in raising the money for the professorship, so many students were willing to contribute funds to the professorship, which helps the college in a great way. It's not only an affirmation of my mentoring and my teaching, but really it's a way to give back to the college, and it was a way to give back to the college. And I was impressed with how many students. It's one thing to say, I like a professor, and it's another thing to say, I liked him well enough to give money to endow a professorship in his name, and that was really very special for me. And I don't think that I could have had that at any other school.
Now, what are your impressions of today's students in general?
Today's students are in many ways like students of the past, and I can still see myself as a college student in many of my students or in my students. I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that. When I came here to Westminster, the student body was a lot less diverse. First of all, I came here. We were still we were not an all-male school, but basically, de facto, Westminster only had a handful of Westminster female students, and we had students from William Woods come over to our classes. But essentially, the Westminster students were politically and culturally a lot less diverse than they are now. And until recently, all of a sudden, the remarkable thing for Westminster was how diverse it had become when we had 150 international students, which I thought was just a real boon to the school, and I hope we can maintain that diversity. I just cherish getting together with alums and running into alums and out of the blue, alums will send me emails saying, I want to say thank you to you for everything you did for me, and here's what I'm doing, and I thought your teaching and mentoringship made a difference in my life, and that's been so important to me. And it's been so important to me to see how many of those 750 students that I mentioned were willing to make contributions to the professorship. And I talked to many of them on the phone, asking them to make a contribution to the professorship, which, by the way, doesn't help me in any way financially. It's going to help whoever has the professorship in the future. And so many former students were willing to contribute. And it's a joy to see them leading lives of success, significance, and service. Really, it truly is. I think this has been my life's work, and the success of these students has been what I have achieved in a certain sense, helped to achieve, I should say, because they've all done it with their own dint of their own hard work, of course. Yeah. Well, Westminster is at a point now where it needs the assistance, the financial assistance of its loyal alums. I love this school, and I know that there are many students out here who also love this school. People have come here, students have come here. Virtually every one of them has been supported by tuition discounts, scholarships, grants. They came here. They were supported in their efforts to get a high-quality education at a great liberal arts college. And I would appeal to them to help make that a reality for other students, to contribute to the general fund, to help this school survive and thrive.